You act like you owe the world something.
Maybe I do. Men.
The sun hung over Dust Creek like it was tired of watching men do cruel things. Its light came through the haze in long, slanting blades, catching on the ropes, the faces, the coins. Somewhere, a horse kicked against its stall. Somewhere else, laughter broke like glass. Ethan Hale stood at the edge of it, all his shadow long across the dirt. He'd been riding for 9 days, and every mile had felt like a prayer God didn't answer. He should have kept riding past this cursed town, but mercy has a way of stopping men who'd rather not remember what it looks like. You ever see a man buy a ghost, someone would ask later? Yeah, another would answer. He bought her that day in Dust Creek. Before we go on, hit the like button and tell us where you're watching from. This one's about the kind of mercy that doesn't erase a sin, it just teaches it how to breathe. The auction yard was nothing more than a patch of trampled dust and splintered wood, but it stank like every sin the frontier could name: whiskey, sweat, and fear. A platform had been thrown together out of wagon planks. Men gathered tight around it, hats low, voices mean. At the center stood a girl, barefoot, wrists tied before her, a tag pinned to her torn dress, Lot 7. The auctioneer barked like a preacher, turned feral. 18. Strong enough for chores, or for company, depends on how you pay. Coins clinked. Laughter rolled through the crowd, thick and sour. Ethan stayed still. His coat hung heavy with trail dust, his hat shadowing eyes that hadn't softened in years. He'd seen slavery before, dressed up as law. He'd spoken Apache once long ago, before the war and the smoke. He remembered a village burning. He remembered the look of a child's hand turning to ash in his palm. That memory was why he didn't walk away. 70, a drunk, barked from the front. The crowd quieted. Everyone knew what 70 bought in Dust Creek. Ethan's voice cut through the heat. 100. The words were calm, low, and final. The auctioneer blinked. You sure? Mr. Ethan met his eyes. I said what I said. The drunk spat into the dirt. Ain't worth it. That one's cursed. Ethan reached into his coat and dropped a pouch of coins that rang like judgment on the wooden table. She's worth this, he said. Sold. The hammer fell. The world shifted. The girl lifted her head slowly like a wounded animal that didn't believe in light anymore. Her hair hung in black tangles, her eyes wide, untrusting. When Ethan stepped toward her, the crowd parted, some sneering, some stepping back, as if mercy might stain their boots. He untied her wrists. The rope left red bands on her skin. You're free now, he said. Her voice came raw, cracked. No one buys freedom. Then call it a trade, Ethan answered. You're paying me with peace. She stared, not understanding, not trusting. He bent slightly, his tone quiet enough to make men around them frown. You can walk, he said, or I can carry you. But you're not staying here. Her knees gave out before she could answer. He caught her, one arm under her knees, one behind her back, and lifted her like she weighed nothing at all. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone laughed nervously. Another muttered, crazy bastard. Ethan turned and walked through them. No one stopped him. The street stretched away in heat and light. Dust rose in gold spirals around his boots. The saloon doors creaked. The sheriff's window reflected him like a ghost walking out of judgment. He passed the jail, the church, the dry riverbed that hadn't seen rain in a month. Every eye followed the giant cowboy and the girl in his arms. She stirred once. Where are you taking me? To the river, he said. You look like someone who needs washing more than saving. He didn't explain what river or why. Maybe because the river wasn't just water. It was the place he went when he couldn't stand to be the man he'd been. They rode in silence. After that, her small frame, wrapped in his trail, coat her head against his chest. By the time they cleared the last shanty on the edge of town, the sun was dropping behind the buttes, turning the dust to blood-colored fire. Night met them halfway. Ethan's horse, a gray named Covenant, moved steady along the ridge road. The girl hadn't spoken since the question. She watched the horizon, as if it might decide what she was. When they reached the hollow where the land dipped into riverbed, Ethan dismounted. This is far enough, he said. He set her down on the soft bank, his movements careful, almost reverent. Moonlight silvered the water. The river ran thin but steady, one of those western streams that refused to die even when the earth forgot it. He knelt, dipped his hands, and let the water fall through his fingers. "Same river the Comanche pray by," he murmured. "Same one that carried soldiers home and washed blood from dirt. If it can clean them, it can clean you." She flinched. "I don't need washing." "Then call it remembering," he said. "You need to remember you're more than what they said." He reached out slow, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. His fingertips brushed her wrist, rough, warm, steady. "You got a name. They called me Ayanna," she whispered. "But they didn't mean it." "Then I'll mean it," he said. "And I'll call you that till you believe it too." Something broke inside her, quiet but deep. She looked at him. Then the scar, running from his jaw to his neck, the eyes that didn't demand anything, only offered. "What's your name, Ethan?" he said. "Ethan, what Hale?" "Just Hale's enough. You some kind of preacher?" He smiled, faint tired. "No, ma'am. Just a man trying to walk a different road than the one I burned." The wind shifted. The smell of sage came with it. Ayanna's fingers trembled as she cupped the river water and wiped her face. The dirt ran dark at first, then clear. "Feels like starting over," she whispered. "It is," he said. "That's what rivers are for." They stayed until the stars came. Ethan built a small fire with driftwood, his motions slow and practiced. Ayanna sat wrapped in his coat, knees drawn, close eyes reflecting flame. "You don't talk much," she said at last. "Don't have much worth saying." "Then why save me?" He looked at the fire. "Because I remember what it's like to wish somebody had." The silence after that wasn't empty. It was full of things neither of them could name. The wind moved through the grass. A coyote cried far off. When Ayanna finally spoke, her voice was small. "You act like you owe the world something." "Maybe I do," Ethan said. "Men like me don't get to forget." "What'd you do?" He poked, the fire sparks rising like memories that refused to die. "Too much. But saving one's soul don't balance the scales. It just keeps them from tipping worse." She studied him through the flicker of light. "You think saving me makes it better?" "No," he said. "But it makes it matter." Later, when the fire had burned down to coals, he spread his blanket on the sand. "Get some sleep," he told her. "You'll leave when I do, won't you?" she asked. "Only if you want me gone." She hesitated, then lay down near the warmth. "Thank you," she whispered. He tipped his hat lower, his voice rough. "Don't thank me yet, Ayanna. Morning's a long way off." But long before dawn, while she slept, he sat awake watching the river shine like steel. He thought of all the ghosts the water had carried, and wondered if mercy ever stopped flowing, or just changed its shape until men like him could touch it again. When the first light came pale and cold, he stood and saddled Covenant. The girl stirred, blinking against the gray. "Is it morning?" she asked. "Almost," he said. "Then we keep riding." He nodded. "If you can stand." She rose slowly, barefoot in the dew. The tag that once read Lot 7 hung from her dress, torn. She looked at it for a long moment, then dropped it into the river. The current took it without a sound. "There," she said softly. "Now it's gone." Ethan watched the ripples fade. "No," he said. "Now it's forgiven." They rode out as the sun climbed the world, spreading wide and gold around them. Behind them, Dust Creek still slept under its own sin. Ahead, the land waited quiet, endless, and maybe willing to give two lost souls another try. And somewhere between the sky and the water, the wind carried a whisper. Only the desert could hear mercy don't end with forgiveness. It just keeps riding. Morning came quiet as a held breath. Mist lay in the willow hollows, thin as wedding veils that never got used. The river moved like a long nerve under the land. Ethan let the gray gelding drink and loosened the cinch 2 holes. Ayanna knelt at the edge and dipped a strip of torn cloth. She wrung it hard, rinsed, wrung again, the rhythm of someone who had learned to keep living by doing small things right. He crouched and washed trail grit from his wrists. The water burned cold, bit the scar under his jaw. Lit the old rope memory like a fuse, then put it out. He stood and gave her space. She wiped her face, throat, the bruised shadow where the tag had rubbed. Darkness bled into the current and vanished. "Down there," he said, pointing toward a sand tongue. "Gentler pull. If you want to wash your hair. Ayana studied him the way a wild mare studies a hand that isn't lying. Then she stepped, ankle-deep teeth, catching breath, and bent to pour the river through her black hair. Tangles gave way. She worked until the strands hung straight as rain. When she lifted her head, the sun came through willows and lit the water beating her lashes. "What does your name mean?" he asked. In one tongue she said it means a flower that keeps blooming where storms don't ask permission. "And to you it means I wasn't meant to break." The coffee pot chattered on a pocket of coals he'd coaxed from last night's hush. He poured 2 tin cups. The steam smelled like morning learning how to forgive. She sat cross-legged across the fire and warmed her hands over it as if catching a promise. "Your scar," she said, eyes on his neck, not on his face. "Knife rope," he said. The word landed heavy. "Didn't take the first time. I keep it to remember." "To remember the man who tied it," she said. "Or to remember you lived both," he said. "One keeps anger alive. The other keeps it tame." She took a sip. "Anger walks faster than mercy." "Most days," he said. "But anger tires sooner." They drank without talk. The river kept speaking in its old language. A dragonfly wrote blue fire across the air and was gone. Ayana rose, crossed to a clay lip, and eased up a small plant with white starflowers levering the dirt with a flat stone so the hair roots kept their hold. She brought it back as if it had asked for gentleness, and been heard pressed a thumb-deep pocket in wet sand, set the plant, and fed it river by hand. "You're planting in a place that floods," he said. "So it will learn," she said. "Learn what the same thing we are." They packed what little could be owned. He stowed blanket rope rifle wrapped in oiled cloth. She tied her hair with a strip from her dress, climbed soft behind the saddle when he offered a palm. "Hold the leather," he said. "Not me." She held the cantle. He felt her weight find the horse's rhythm, the way a heart finds its beat again, after it forgets. They rode upriver under cottonwoods combing light. The sky sharpened to that hard blue that tells a man distance is closer than it looks. A pair of vultures stitched slow circles over a far shelf. A meadowlark tried a note and quit as if it remembered a safer song. "Tell me about yesterday," she said from behind him. "Not the price, the choice." He let the silence shake what didn't matter off the words. "I heard the bid like a door slam," he said. "So I opened a different door." "Which house?" "The one where I stopped hating myself for what I didn't do," he said. "And what did you do?" she asked. "Rode when I should have stood," he said. "Stood when I should have left. Looked away when smoke started. Spoke when quiet was needed. Shut up when a voice might have kept someone breathing." He breathed out slow. "You don't need my ledger?" I asked, she said. He nodded. "Then there was a boy with a cut that bled more than it hurt. He tried not to cry. I told him he could. He did. Then he stopped. Later I made a choice that left him in the dirt. That's the rope I wear. What became of him I don't know," he said. "But sometimes I hear him when the water's loud." She said nothing. That was good. Not all debts can stand to be spoken of. They shaded up at a bend where a sycamore's roots gripped the bank like a fist. He loosened the saddle, passed her the canteen tore bread tasted salt beef. She watched him mend a coat pocket with neat soldier plain stitches. "You sew like someone taught you," she said. "The trail did," he answered. "It's a mean teacher, but thorough." Wind rose, smelling of warm rock and wild mint. She reached to touch the scar beneath his jaw, then stopped, short hand curling empty. He pretended not to see. Mercy sometimes means not noticing what a person can't finish. They started again. The river kept them company, the kind of company that doesn't ask for talk. Mid-afternoon, the gelding pricked an ear and took a half-step sideways. On a wet sand tongue, Ethan saw 3 iron crescents, punched into damp grit. He slid down and crouched. Edges rounded, hours old. One narrow pony shod. One deep, big-boned rider tilting wrong from a bad hip or a crooked saddle. One light kid or small man. He turned his head to listen for what tracks couldn't tell. The bend threw sound back at him in pieces. "Riders?" Ayana asked. "Were," he said. "Maybe watered here, maybe just changed their mind. You think they hunt? I think they move like men with a purpose." He stood. And men with a purpose usually turn into trouble. Her eyes went to the willow line. A small knot of thought tightened the space between her brows and smoothed again. The world had taught her to make decisions fast and forget the wait later, or at least carry it quiet. "Another hour," he said. "There's an old cabin up valley. Honest roof. Shallow well. You know it." "I used to." They reached it with the day thinning from brass to copper. The cabin leaned into the slope as if listening to a story it half remembered. One pane left in the window cracked like lightning caught and kept. Grass had learned to grow through the step because nobody told it different. He checked the yard, deer clefts, quail scratches, no fresh boots. Inside smelled of cedar and yesterday's coffee. A chair lay on its side. He righted it and chalked the short leg with a sliver of shingle. On the mantel sat a blue marble, the kind a boy saves because it feels like the whole sky. "Whose place?" she asked. "A man who liked to argue after the air was tired," he said. "Gone now. Dead maybe. Maybe he just found a quieter kind of life." He coaxed flame from tinder. Ayanna moved the perimeter of the room like reading it with her shoulder. She did not smile at the marble. She just put her hand on the mantel, a heartbeat longer than needed, the way you pay respect to a name you don't know. "You can take the bed," he said. "It remembers people kindly. And you? I'll keep first watch outside. New rooms lie, and I don't like being surprised by truth." "That won't help if men come," she said. "It helps me," he said. "It says I did what I could." They ate beans, he softened, with bacon ends and patience. Fire made the room gold at the edges and shadow in the middle. After she took a small bundle from the seam she'd sewn into her dress, he looked away by looking busy. She unwrapped rawhide twined with 2 beads, one blue, one bone white. She held them the way a person holds a silence that belongs to her. "What are they?" he asked, soft. "From a shirt that doesn't exist," she said. "From a man who might." He didn't ask if the man was brother, father, husband. Grief belongs to whoever can carry it. She extended the bundle. He lifted a hand, lowered it. "I won't keep what isn't mine." "Hold," she said. "Not keep." He did. The rawhide warmed against his palm. It was light, like some promises, the kind that changes a shoulder anyway. Dusk took the yard. Wind ran a cool hand across the cabin face. They stood at the fence he'd once built from mesquite and stubbornness. She pressed fingertips into damp earth until they rose mapped with brown. "You ever believe water can teach a name back to someone who lost it?" she asked. "I believe it keeps saying the name till someone remembers to answer," he said. "Tomorrow," she said, "we answer." They slept in shifts. He took first watch under a moon coin caught above the swale. Twice the river made a sound that wasn't entirely water. Twice the quiet chose not to be broken. Near midnight she touched his shoulder and took the rifle like it belonged in her hands and not in the world's. Dawn came reading them both for courage. They watered the horse, finished the last bread. He gave back the bundle without speech. She set it where her dress kept the space warm over her heart. "I'll fetch wood," he said. "You stay in." "I'll carry half," she said. "You don't have to. Neither do you." They had made 3 trips when the sound came thin at first, more felt in the wood of the fence than heard in the air. Ayanna froze with 2 sticks across her forearms. Ethan lifted his head and closed his eyes to listen with the part of a man that isn't ears. Hoofbeats. Not many, not fast, not law steady, not drunk crooked. Purpose. 3, she breathed. "Maybe 2 and a mule," he said. Dust learned his throat. Too sure for vagrants, not sure enough for soldiers. Dust Creek. Maybe he said, which often meant yes. The sound went behind the ridge and disappeared into a draw like a hand pulling back from a candle. He didn't move. The air thickened and thinned at once, the space between lightning and thunder, when the world already decided only hasn't told you how. On the far edge of the swale he saw a willow switch, stuck upright in a heel gouge, a sign men leave each other when they travel apart, but plan to meet the same door. Inside he said not loud, "We'll make coffee." "Coffee," she said, testing the shape of surrender. "That is a brave thing." "It is," he said. He shut the door, set the latch, fed the ash a breath. Flame licked up from coals that had only been pretending to be dead. While the kettle heated, he cleaned the rifle slow and exact. She sat the chair she'd steadied last night and watched the window's knife of day cut across the floor. The kettle sang. They poured. On the table he set the blue marble. He turned it with a finger. It caught light and pulsed like a small living thing. "Men are coming," she said, not asking. "Yes." "Mercy doesn't hide," she said. "No." They looked at door and window the way two people read a page they can't change. The river, close unseen, kept up its old sermon about letting go. Wind leaned on the wall and didn't push. Metal clicked against stone far off. A horse blew soft. The day held its breath. "If we run," she said, "we become the stories they tell to make their cruelty sound like law." She set her cup down. "If we stand, we become ourselves." He watched the blade of light across the floor. It did not tremble. "We stand," he said. After coffee, they drank until the cups were empty and honest. He laid the rifle on the table and unwrapped a small parcel from his coat, a silver cross tarnished from years-hidden chain broken clean at the loop. "I'm not a preacher," he said, answering the joke she hadn't made. "But my mother asked me to carry this till I stopped needing to prove I was lost." He set it down. "Maybe I'm close to done proving." Ayanna looked from the cross to his hands. She took the rawhide bundle from her dress and placed it beside the cross. Two small lives on old wood. She didn't say what it meant. She let the act say it. A knock came. Not loud. Measured. The kind men use when they want to hear fear move inside a room. Ethan rose, picked up the rifle, and walked to the door. He did not open it. He set his voice low enough to be kind, hard enough to be law in a country that didn't have much. Morning. A pause. "Dust scraped under a boot," Mr. Oman said. "Not the auctioneer. Younger. We're looking for property that slipped its halter." "This is a bad place to talk about property," Ethan said. A dry chuckle. "You can make it a worse one." Another voice, older, willing to let other men do his laughing. "We ain't law," he said. "But we can borrow some if we need it." "Then borrow decency while you're at it," Ethan said. Silence tight as a cinch. "Open up," the younger voice said, friendliness curling raw. "Maybe we all see we don't have to draw pictures of wolves where there's only stray dogs." Ethan felt Ayanna at his back without her touching him. He said, "That river out there has two habits. It forgives and it remembers. I'm trying for both." He lifted the latch and opened to the width of his breath. Three men, as he'd guessed, kid on a narrow pony, a big-boned sorrel under a hip-crooked rider, with a scarred mustache, and a mule behind, with a pack saddle too new for honest work. Dust Creek, hats, Dust Creek faces. The kid's eyes were hard because he was practicing. The mustache eyes were tired because he'd stopped. "You stole something," the mustache said. "I took someone out of a fire," Ethan said. "You want to argue, bring water." He didn't raise the rifle. He didn't need to yet. He stood square with a cabin at his back, a river at his right, and a woman behind him who had planted a flower where floods come on purpose. The kid looked past Ethan's shoulder and saw Ayanna through the slice of door. Something mean and pleased went through his mouth. "That's lot 7, he said. Ayanna stepped forward into the light with a small exact movement. She did not hide behind Ethan. She didn't raise her chin high either, just enough to name herself without speaking. "My name is Ayanna," she said. The mustache flicked eyes to the kid. "Names don't change papers," he said. "Papers don't change breath," she answered. Ethan felt the room take her side. Even the chair, steadied by its shingle, seemed to lean toward her. The kid's hand twitched near his holster. The mustache breathed out through his nose and didn't move. The third man, the silent one, shifted in his saddle and glanced at the mule as if it had come farther than it wanted for less than it liked. Ethan said, "You got 2 roads. 1 you turn around. 2 you try the door." "What's behind door 2? the kid asked. "Dirt," Ethan said. "One way or the other." The mustache studied Ethan's face the way old wolves study snares. He lifted a palm small, almost polite. "We'll come back with papers," he said. "Men who can read them." "Bring a preacher too," Ethan said, and shut the door. The latch set with a click loud as thunder in the small room. Ayanna exhaled, then inhaled like someone learning to own air again. He leaned his forehead against the crossbeam a beat, then turned. "They'll be back," she said. "Yes," he said. "We don't run. We answer," she said. "We answer," he said. And his voice found something inside it that hadn't broken when the rope tried. He checked the rifle, laid spare rounds on the table like beads. She knelt by the hearth and fed the fire just enough to keep it honest. Outside hoofbeats faded into the ridge, and then were only the idea of hoofbeats. The river kept on with its slow, tireless lesson. Ethan picked up the silver cross, and the rawhide held both in the same hand. He didn't pray. He listened. A long time later he set them back down side by side. "Today we build," he said. "Even a little. Men who plan to stay leave shapes behind them." "What shape?" she asked. "A fence post that won't rot before summer ends. A shelf that won't drop a cup. A notch in this door that says it belonged to people not to fear." She nodded. She tied her hair again. She rolled her sleeve. And for a little while they worked quiet, precise choosing boards, measuring against the frame, hammering when the silence needed a hard word, and stopping when it didn't. Near noon, a hawk threw its shadow across the yard like a warning made of grace. They both looked up. The shadow passed and did not return. "Mercy," she said softly, "is a road that doesn't promise anything. It promises one thing," he said, "that it won't lie about the distance." She thought about that, then smiled the smallest smile. "Then we walk." They did. They walked the length of the day between river and room, between fear and the work that keeps fear from owning names. And when the light finally leaned long and thin through the crack in the pane, the world felt no safer. It felt truer. They sat. They drank the last coffee as if it were a sacrament they had made themselves. He put his hat on. She set her palm to the floor and felt the cabin's heartbeat, firefoot breath. Outside the ridge held its silence like a blade. Inside, two people practiced answering, and the river, unbothered by paper or price, kept saying the only word it knew for mercy again, until even the dust leaned closer to hear. The storm rolled in, without rain, just thunder, and the smell of metal in the air. Ethan stood by the door, the rifle across his knees, listening. Inside, Ayanna built a small fire, her hands steady, her face soft in the light. "You still hearing them?" she asked. "Always," he said. "Can't live that way. I don't know another way." That earned him a small smile, quick as lightning and gone as soon as it came. They cooked together, beans, salt pork, silence. When she passed him the cup, he caught a tremor in her wrist, but didn't name it. Outside, thunder rolled once, slow and far away. "You think mercy wins?" she asked. "Mercy doesn't win," he said. "It just refuses to lose." She nodded as if she already knew. After they ate, he sat by the window cleaning the rifle. Ayanna traced her fingers through the firelight, quiet, watching him. "You don't talk about where you're from. Nothing left there worth talking about. And here's what's left after." She looked at him a long time. "You bought me because you felt guilty, didn't you?" He met her eyes. "No, because I remember what it looks like when nobody does." Rain started soft on the roof. They listened. Ayanna stretched her hand toward the heat. A spark caught her wrist. She hissed, brushing it away. Ethan crossed the space between them, caught her hand, poured water from the canteen. "You'll be fine. I've healed worse," she said. "I know." He let go slowly. When the rain ended, they stepped outside. The world smelled of wet sage and smoke. Ayanna lifted her face to the sky, eyes closed. "You ever think forgetting's just another kind of dying?" He looked up too. "Then I've died plenty." She turned toward him, wet hair clinging to her cheek. "Maybe this time live different." Near dawn, a crack split the quiet gunfire, faint but real. Ethan was on his feet before the echo faded. "Riders?" she asked. "Could be." He doused the fire, shouldered the rifle. "If they come, we move to the ridge. The river hides what it forgives. And if they don't, then we keep breathing." She nodded. "Then we keep." He looked at her, at the firelight fading behind them, at the small plant she'd saved growing by the wall. "Packlight," he said. "The world's heavy enough." They rode out into gray morning. The cabin shrank behind them, the river running beside like a promise that refused to die. Neither spoke for miles. Then Ayanna said, "You think mercy can outrun bullets?" Ethan smiled faintly. maybe not. But it knows how to walk through them. She nodded, eyes forward, wind lifting her hair, and for a moment between the gunfire behind and the horizon ahead, they looked like two people who might just live long enough to find out what mercy really means. The morning came sharp and pale, the kind that told truth without kindness. Ethan felt them before he saw them, the weight in the air, the way the horse lifted its head. He checked the rifle, said quietly, "They're coming." Ayanna didn't flinch. She pressed the last post into the fence, wiped dust from her palms. "How many? 3, he said. "Maybe 4. They stepped inside the cabin. Ethan laid 6 bullets on the table. Ayanna set her knife beside them. Outside, hooves slowed. Voices low, certain. "A knock, mister," a man said. "We're here for lot 7. Ethan opened the door a hand's width. "She's not a lot. She's got a name." "That what it says on your paper?" Another laughed. Ayanna stepped forward, eyes steady. "My name is Ayanna." The lead man smirked. "Names don't change what's bought." Ethan's voice stayed calm. "Then you can take that lie back to the man who sold it." Silence. Then the man said, "We'll call this theft." "You'll find a grave," Ethan said, and shut the door. Gunfire cracked. Wood splintered. Ethan counted the pause, fired once. A shout answered, "Hit, not dead." Ayanna crawled to the hearth, pulled the table across the doorway, and braced it with her shoulder. The second shot came through the window. She ducked, then caught the blue marble before it hit the floor, and set it gently back on the mantel. "Left side," she whispered. Ethan shifted, fired again. Silence followed, the kind that listens. "2 left," he said. She nodded. "If one falls, the other runs." Not grief yet. He smiled faintly. "Not yet." The next voice was young, the boy from the auction yard. "Give her back, mister. She's not yours to take," Ethan said. The boy's hand shook near his gun. Ayanna stood in the doorway before Ethan could stop her. "I'm not your paper," she said. "I'm not your price. Go home before you forget how." The boy froze. His gun lowered. The older man beside him sneered. "She talks pretty." He raised his pistol. Ethan fired first. 1 shot. The man fell, quiet, final. The boy flinched, pale, and stepped back. "Take him," Ethan said. "Go." The boy hesitated, then tipped his hat to Ayanna, a boy's clumsy apology, and led the horses away. When the dust settled, Ethan set the rifle down, hands shaking in the mercy after violence. Ayanna took his wrist and pressed it to the cool water bucket. "Always a choice," he said softly. "Just not always peace with it." "Peace is work," she said. "Not a gift." He laughed once, hollow but real. "Then we better keep working." They buried the man by the willow. No words, no prayer, just earth closing where cruelty had stood. Back at the cabin they mended what was broken, hung a new plank on the door. When the sun dipped low, Ayanna pressed new soil around the small plant by the step. "What do we call this place?" she asked. Ethan looked at the river. "What does it call itself?" She touched the ground. "A place that listens." He nodded. "Then we listen." They sat on the step until stars showed. The cabin behind them breathed steady. The river hummed below. Somewhere, far off, hooves faded for good. Ayanna leaned against the post. "Do you think they'll come back?" "Maybe," he said. "But mercy waits longer than hate." She smiled faintly. "Then we'll wait too." The night settled clean and wide. And when morning came, the cabin still stood, the river still spoke, and 2 souls, tired but unbroken, listened together. The world woke cold and still. Ethan knew before sound came, the air had that tight weight before trouble. He looked toward the ridge. Dust moved like ghosts, learning to walk. "They're coming," he said. Ayanna didn't pause from stacking wood. "How many? 3, maybe 4. They stepped inside. He set 6 bullets on the table. She laid her knife beside them. The room smelled of ash and rain. Outside huoves, slow men muttering. A knock, calm, confident. "Mister," a voice said. "We're here for lot 7. Ethan opened the door just enough to show his eyes. "She's got a name." "That what it says on the paper?" the man said, grinning. Ayanna came forward. "My name is Ayanna. Paper can burn. I don't. The man's smile faltered. "You were sold. You can't sell what the river's already washed clean," Ethan said, and shut the door. The first bullet hit wood. Splinters flew. Ethan counted 1, 2, and fired back. A scream, then silence. He moved like he'd done this before, slow, sure, sad. Another shot broke the window. Ayanna dropped low, pushed the table to block the door, and caught the blue marble before it rolled away. She set it gently back on the mantel. "Left," she whispered. He shifted, fired again. The echo ran up the valley. When the smoke cleared, a young voice called out, "Give her up, mister. Don't make this worse." "She's not yours," Ethan said. The boy stepped into view, no older than 19, trembling under the weight of his gun. Ayanna moved to the doorway. "I'm not your paper," she said. "Not your price. Go home before the land stops forgiving you." The boy froze. His pistol wavered. The older man beside him spat. "She talks too proud." He raised his gun. Ethan fired once. The man dropped like a sack of dust. The boy went pale. "You didn't have to, I did," Ethan said. "Now go." The boy looked at Ayanna, eyes wet with shame, and tipped his hat before leading the horses away. Silence fell heavy. Ethan lowered the rifle. His hand shook now that danger had passed. Ayanna took his wrist, pressed it to the cold water bucket until the tremor stilled. "Always a choice," he murmured. "Just not always peace with it." "Peace isn't something you find," she said softly. "You build it." He gave a tired smile. "Then we'll start here." They buried the man under the willow near the river. No prayer, just earth, and the sound of water forgiving. Ethan tamped the soil flat. The ground remembers slower than we do. Ayanna brushed dirt from her palms. Then let it take its time. Back at the cabin, they mended what was broken, patched the wall, swept the glass, set the blue marble back where it belonged. When the work was done, the air felt different, cleaner, heavier, honest. "What do we call this place?" she asked. He looked toward the river. "What does it call itself?" She smiled. "A place that listens." He nodded. "Then we listen." They sat together on the step. The sky turned copper, then silver. Somewhere down the valley, a hawk cried once and was gone. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked. "Maybe," he said. "But mercy waits longer than hate." Ayanna leaned against him, eyes half closed. "Then we wait too." The stars climbed. The cabin stood. The river whispered its one true word again, and for the first time Ethan believed it might mean peace. The dawn after the gunfire came soft, like the land had decided to forgive. Mist lifted slow from the river. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke. Ayanna stood barefoot on the step, watching sunlight crawl across the grave soil beneath the willow. Ethan joined her, coffee in hand. "You didn't sleep," he said. "Didn't want to," she answered. The quiet felt alive. They didn't speak for a while. The world around them did all the talking. River birds whined in the grass. Then she said, "We can't stay ghosts here forever." He looked at her. "Then we make it a home." They worked through the day. He fixed the roof, she cleared the field near the bank. Each swing of the axe, each pull of the hoe sounded like punctuation in a prayer neither of them wanted to say out loud. By noon, the sweat on their backs tasted of salt and sun. They stopped to rest by the water. Ayanna knelt, letting the current slip through her fingers. "This river," she said, "it's seen too much blood." Ethan dipped his hat in the water, poured it over his head. "Then maybe that's why it keeps moving." "Maybe that's what we do too," she said. He smiled faintly. "If we're lucky." Afternoon turned gold. Ayanna brought seeds she'd hidden in her shawl since before Dust Creek corn sage, and one small pouch of wild flower seeds. She pressed them into the soil near the cabin. Ethan knelt beside her, helping his large hands, gentle, as if afraid to break the world she was making. "You plant like someone who believes in tomorrow," he said. She looked at him. "And you build like someone who's still learning how." That earned her his quiet laugh, rare, real, a sound that made the day warmer. When evening fell, they sat by the fire outside. The river whispered below. The stars came slow and sure. Ayanna handed him a strip of cloth embroidered with blue and white beads. "This was my mother's," she said. "She tied it to my wrist the day the soldiers came. I thought I'd lost it." He turned it in his hand, light glinting from the beads. "You trust me with this, I trust what you've done, more than what you promised," she said. He tied it around his wrist. "Then I'll wear it until the river forgets my name." "Don't let it," she said. "The river forgets slow." Later, when the fire burned low, Ayanna whispered, "You think mercy ever ends?" Ethan shook his head. "It changes shape, sometimes into a roof, sometimes into a hand that doesn't pull away." She smiled at that. "Then maybe we've found ours." He stared into the fire, the orange light soft against his scar. "I used to think mercy was just for people who'd done good," he